Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Kennard, and I'm going to start by being brutally honest with you. The only reason I'm here is because I'm married to Deborah Diane Kennedy, who's on the board of directors of the Charleston Literary Festival. And I am finding that there are many, many benefits to being married to a member of the board, one of which is I get to introduce this very exciting session this afternoon with Jonathan Eig, who of course is the author of the widely acclaimed biography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Jonathan will be in conversation with Brandon Reid, the public historian at the International African American Museum. Before I introduce the session and Brandon and Jonathan, I've been asked to tell all of you to please silence your cell phones. So Jonathan Eig began his career as a journalist working in his hometown for his hometown newspaper at the tender age of 16. So unlike me and probably a lot of other people in this room, he had no ambivalence about what he wanted to do in life as a very young person. He went on to write for the country's leading newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. But at some point in Jonathan's career, he decided to leave full-time journalism to write books. Jonathan has written 6 books, including award-winning biographies of Muhammad Ali, Lou Gehrig, and frankly, I don't have time to tell you about all the awards that Jonathan has received for all these books, but there are a lot of them. Brandon Reid, our interlocutor today, is the public historian at the International African American Museum here in Charleston, which opened just in June of this year. We're very proud of that new institution here in Charleston. Before that, Brandon spent several years at the National Museum of African American Music in Nashville, Tennessee. He received a master's degree in public history from Middle Tennessee State University. Now, the subject of Jonathan's latest book, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is highly personal to me. As a youngster, I remember my parents bringing home the recordings of the speeches of Dr. King, and they would play them over and over in our household. And it was their way of impressing upon me and my siblings the importance of this man in our lives. I think my parents knew that we were the first generation of African Americans who would grow up in a world shaped by Dr. King and the movement that he inspired and led. Later in life, I came to realize that King shaped my life more than any other public figure. Were it not for him, were it not for this man, I would have not gone to the schools that I went to, including the law school where I met my wife. I would not have had the opportunities in the public sector and the private sector, which were denied to my parents and their generation. And in fact, I'm pretty sure I would not be living here in Charleston, South Carolina. My life, indeed the lives of all Americans, were fundamentally changed by the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, over the years, I've read several biographies of Dr. King. I dare say all the major ones. This one is very different. Jonathan's work paints a very intimate portrait of King as a person, as a husband, a father, a son. In this book, we walk beside King in his moments of great triumph, but also in his moments of deep despair and moments of self-doubt. We come to understand his frailties and his flaws, and as Jonathan writes in the book, we come to understand that, quote, his power grew from his ability to grapple with the contradiction, to wrestle with the doubt, just as King's biblical heroes did. In other words, Jonathan allows us to see the fullness of King's humanity. In the prologue to the book, Jonathan writes, and I quote, "In the process of canonizing King, we've defanged him." He says, "This book seeks to recover the real man from the gray mist of hagiography." It is a truly masterful work, which the New York Times dubbed, quote, "the definitive work on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a monumental work that is worthy of its subject." Jonathan, it is my great honor to welcome you to the Charleston Literary Festival.
All right. Hello, everyone. How are you all doing today? Awesome. So again, my name is Brandon Reid, the public historian for the International African American Museum, and I've had the distinct pleasure in this partnership to be in conversation with the Charleston Literary Festival. So thank you all again for allowing us to come out here and support this program, and thank you, Jonathan, for a very brief read in King. Those of you who didn't get that joke haven't quite yet bought your book, but you'll have a chance to do that today. But sort of the theme for the conversation today, and sort of the themes of my conversations with Sarah and the team at the Charleston Literary Festival have all sort of revolved around this idea of embracing the conversation. And what does that really mean? Embracing the conversation means becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I will say for me that this book in some ways made me somewhat uncomfortable. Not in the sense that it wasn't magnificently written and just an amazing read that kept me captivated and turning the page from page to page and really wanting to continue going down that path and following King's journey, but it made me uncomfortable because I remember early on in my sort of education, we would hear about certain African-American heroes or icons. You would hear about Harriet Tubman, you would hear about Dr. King, you would hear about Malcolm X and so on and so forth, but you would really only hear about specific parts of their life, specific parts of their story. And I always wondered why that was. And so in reading this book and getting a chance to have a more intimate conversation and journey alongside Dr. King, it was really uncomfortable for me because I was seeing him in a new, different way. I was seeing him in a new light, and I was seeing him as a human being. And that got me thinking about what it means to be a public historian, what it means to continue to sort of do this work, and what we're trying to accomplish here at the International African American Museum. We're trying to set the stage for embracing these conversations that may be a little bit more challenging, that may be a little bit more difficult, that may be a little bit more harder to have, either fully vocally or internally as well. But that does not mean that they do not need to happen. That just means that we need to be a little bit more intentional about how we're striving to embrace these conversations. And so that brings me to my first question, which may be a little bit challenging, but I'm hoping that after reading the book, I know it's a little bit more simple in some ways as well. I wanted to know that if beyond the myths, the movements, and the meanings that have been assigned to the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, I want to know, Jonathan, if you can tell us who was King?
Wow. Well, it's a 600-page book, Brandon. You can pretty much go, and I'll take it from here. Well, you did say you were going to try to make this uncomfortable, and I made King uncomfortable for you. So that's a great question. Who is he? And you know, it was Dick Gregory who put the question to me. I was working on my Muhammad Ali book, and it was Dick Gregory who said to me, if you're going to write about a figure like Ali, you got to understand what made him think he could be special. And he said to me, too, Martin Luther King was like Jesus, except we've got videotape of Martin Luther King. That's the difference. And that just made me think, like, who is this guy? What made King, just as I raised the question with Ali, what made him think he could be Martin Luther King Jr., right? He's not Martin Luther King Jr. even when he's born. That's not even his name. He's Mike King. He's Little Mike. He's ML. He inherits this name because his father decides that it sounds better, that it links them to this great reformer, this great protester. And suddenly, the expectations for him go up. But what makes it possible for ML, little Mike, to become the Nobel Prize winner, to become Saint Martin, really? And I think the story is so complicated, it's miraculous, really, but it's also rooted so much in reality. His father is a sharecropper. His father's born in Stockbridge, Georgia, grows up on this farm, picking cotton, and decides one day that and he sees it destroy his own father. He sees it turn his own father, Jim King, to alcohol and violence, and he says, I've got to get out of here. And at age 12, ties his only pair of shoes over his shoulders and walks out of Stockbridge, Georgia, toward Atlanta, and begins to reimagine the possibilities of being a black man in America, and finds some answers in the Bible, finds some answers in school, and begins to think that maybe his kids can do better. And it's that decision that makes it possible for ML to become Martin Luther King Jr. It's his parents' courage. It's the courage of the previous generations, who we don't give a whole lot of credit for when we think about the civil rights movement, but the people who began to bang on those doors beforehand. And then it's the church, because Martin Luther King Jr. is doing everything he does because he believes in God, because he's trying to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. And his decisions are so firmly guided by his faith. We lose sight of that sometimes. You know, we call him Dr. King, and we forget that he was Reverend King before he was Dr. King. So that's a short answer, but it's just touching on who was he? He was a man who believed that he really could live up to the principles of the Bible, and it wasn't just there to preach. It wasn't just there to recite verses. He believed that he could really try to uphold those principles and preach to the nation, save the nation's soul. He really believed that.
Well, I threw you a bit of a curveball with that first question. You handled it well.
Thank you.
But from what I'm hearing from you is that in the midst of all of these different aspirations, these goals, these different ideas, and even in sort of identities that were placed upon him at a later date, he was a young African-American male with a dream, someone coming up and seeing, and perhaps even learning aspects of that dream from his father and his grandfather, and seeing that passed down through him through his lived experiences. One of the things that we strive to do at the International African American Museum is really to explore the idea of authentic and empathetic storytelling, of making sure that we're able to really get into those uncomfortable conversations. And one of the things I've noticed as I've continued to learn and sort of delve more deeply into African American history is that sometimes individuals try to romanticize the past. They'll talk about specific moments in that history while glossing over others and really not getting into, again, all these different parts that make up the full story. And so I wanted to know, we talked about this a little bit towards the back as well as we were kind of introducing one another and sort of getting into the things. I wanted to know sort of what were your goals with this project kind of early on as you started thinking about how you wanted to take this journey alongside King, and how you wanted your readers to have the opportunity to have this more intimate conversation on the life and legacy of Dr. King?
Thanks, that's a great question. And I have to say, I visited the museum yesterday, and it did make me uncomfortable. And it did force all of these conflicting feelings about the pride of the culture that came from slavery, and the brutality behind it, and it's just still processing it. And I wanted to restore some of that complexity to the King story, because one of the problems, one of the unintended consequences of turning King into our greatest black national hero and building monuments and making national holidays is that you end up sticking to the safe parts. And Harry Belafonte talked to me about this a lot. I was so fortunate to interview him a couple of times. And he said, we only like dead radicals in this country. It's not funny, it's true. Because once they're dead, we can handle them, and we can start to water down their stories, and we can pick the parts that we can live with. And he said that maybe, and of course he supported the creation of the King holiday, and he worked to help make it happen. But maybe in the long run, it's done more harm than good. I don't know about that. It would be a great subject for a high school debate. But what he was pointing out was that when we make him a national hero, and we start to teach the parts that are the easiest and the most comfortable, like I Have a Dream and content of our character, we intentionally ignore the parts that make us uncomfortable, and we forget that the first half of the I Have a Dream speech talks about police brutality and reparations and income inequality, and that it was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. We don't teach that part in our schools. We don't really teach much of King's own writing beyond I Have a Dream. Letter from Birmingham Jail, maybe. But I think that my goal for this book was to try to ask, hoping that we would re-engage with the controversial King, with the difficult King. 70% of Americans opposed the March on Washington. In the last 3 years of King's death, he was the majority of Americans said they disapproved of Martin Luther King, period. Not just like his tactics, not just this particular march, not just the fact that he was calling out the Vietnam War. In general, he had lost the vote of especially white Americans. But we need to remember that, and he suffered for it. And why did he suffer? In part, it was because the FBI was out to destroy him and was deliberately, intentionally trying to damage his reputation and break up the civil rights movement. That's part of why he suffered. But it's important for us to remember that he persevered, that he fought through all of that because he still believed and he never lost hope, despite the fact that he was depressed. He suffered from probably clinical depression. He attempted suicide twice as a teenager. I don't think he was a very happy guy most of the time because the burden on him was so great and because his own country had turned against him. Absolutely. That's the story, some of what I wanted to get across.
Awesome. So let's talk about what was able to allow him to overcome these obstacles, which was, alongside a strong family connection, also his faith. For the African-American community coming out of the period of enslavement and going into the Reconstruction era, even before then as well, faith has always been part of the backbone of the community. Individuals, we talk about the International African-American Museum at Gadsden's Wharf, which is our very sacred site that we're trying to be very intentional about how we're telling that story. It was actually inspired by this idea of a hush harbor, in which on the plantation, these captive Africans would secret themselves away in the middle of the night, and they would go to the outskirts of the plantation, and they would be able to speak with each other after dealing with all these different circumstances and this trauma that they had to overcome on the day-to-day experiences. They would be able to, in these small increments of time, be able to be in conversation with one another, be able to pray with one another, be able to practice their own spiritual beliefs, and so on and so forth. Find ways to transform their West Central African spiritual beliefs and really pass that knowledge down, and so on and so forth. But what kept them going, and the backbone of King as well, was his faith. Can you talk about sort of King's upbringing in the church and so what that meant to him and how it transformed him into someone who was able to and willing to die for his beliefs in the very end?
Yeah, as you note, Christianity was presented to, forced upon the enslaved people, and yet it became a source of enormous strength, and it became the backbone of the civil rights movement. It became the lesson that allowed them to transcend, to rise above, and to preach that if you believe in God, if you believe in the Bible, then you have to agree that all people are created equal, that we're all made in God's image. So King finds his message through that. He finds a message that speaks not only to the black community that he's preaching to, that he's speaking to when the Montgomery bus boycott begins, but a message that also forces a lot of white people to go, oh yeah, wait a second. He might have a point there. And it's King's great genius that he's able to take these teachings. His father was a preacher, his grandfather was a preacher, his maternal great-grandfather was a preacher while he was enslaved. This is deep in his blood, and he knows it so well. And the thing that makes King so special is that he has this ability to speak to the working class, to the average person who's riding the buses in Montgomery and is now walking, uniting in a standing up to the white power structure. But he is also, because he's been raised in the South, but he's been educated in the North, he's got a PhD, he's also able to infuse this message with philosophy, with messages from the Constitution, from the Bill of Rights, and he creates this package, this message that's really almost impossible to deny. You may be struggling emotionally with the idea that you don't want to give up power as a white person in the South. You don't want to give up this situation that has been so good to you for so long. But what he's saying is very difficult to argue with, and it begins to crack certain people's consciences. At the same time, it also takes away the fear of so many others who've been taught that they can't rise up and fight because there will be repercussions. He takes away that fear for people, and it's all coming from his faith.
Now, if I recall correctly from the book, King actually originally did not want to go into preaching. He actually wanted to sort of venture out and try some other things before, well, I feel as though it'd be better to let you tell the story at that point, but can you talk a little bit about sort of his journey towards preaching and what that meant for him to make that decision?
Yeah, like a lot of us, he didn't want to go into his father's line of work, right? And he was embarrassed by his father. I'm sure none of us can relate to that either. But he thought his father was a country preacher. He was too emotional. He stomped and shouted, and ML was already as a kid thinking that he was more sophisticated, that he was more educated, more polished. He, skipped some grades in school. He went to Morehouse at 15. So he's thinking doctor, he's thinking lawyer, but he never gets too far from that. The pull of the church is so great. He goes to one summer to work as a tobacco farmer in Connecticut. Morehouse students were invited to work summers, and the money would go toward their tuition. They'd get free transportation. And while there, he begins preaching to the other tobacco farmers, and voluntarily, right? He doesn't have to take that job. He also takes a job in the kitchen because he realizes he gets more food that way. Smart guy. And but it's after he has an encounter with the police in Connecticut. They pull him and some of his friends over. We don't know why, probably just because there were black people in a car driving through Hartford. And he's so nervous about his father finding out that he's had a run-in with the police that he calls home and says, "By the way, I've decided I am going to become a preacher." He's hoping that will please his parents, and they won't be too upset about the encounter with the police. And his friend from college said, ML says that he was called to the pulpit by God, but I say he was chased there by the police. Either way, he found his place.
I'm often thinking, as I think about sort of going back to the book, and he's going on that journey to figure out, okay, now I'm going to be a preacher. Now I need to figure out what my message is, because he didn't want to have the same message as his father. And so I think about the role of education and the church within, again, the black community, of not only providing that sanctuary, that space of solace for many, but also having that place of individuals being able to come in and sort of impart that racial upliftment, those threads of knowledge and so on and so forth. And so I know for King, as he was doing his journey, his studies, he was doing a mixing of sort of thoughts around racial upliftment and justice, and thinking about the plights of the poor man, while also tying in the sort of Greek philosophy and things of that nature as well. Can you talk about sort of his unique approach towards preaching and what that meant for him in his sort of later years?
Yeah, he saw himself as an intellectual. He wanted to preach for a while, and then he thought maybe he'd become a college professor or a college president someday. But the pulpit is where he was the happiest. And I think the point that you're alluding to is that he recognized that this was the ideal place to combine social uplift with saving souls and saving the soul of the nation, because the black social gospel is about not just making yourself better, but about the responsibility that comes with it to make the world better. And in particular, that meant fighting racial prejudice, because at the core of it, the Bible can't be true if we don't believe that the world can be made more just, then the Bible must be wrong. And that's when King really finds his voice with that message. It's in Montgomery, actually. And again, even in Montgomery, he's not looking to become an activist. He's thinking about getting used to his church. He's thinking about maybe he'll preach for a while and then he'll teach. And when the Montgomery bus boycott begins, he's asked to become the spokesman for the movement. Not even to be the leader, they needed somebody to give a speech 2 days after Rosa Parks was arrested. Somebody who might be able to convince the community that if we all stick together and stay off the buses on Monday, we might be able to force a change. The buses in Montgomery were obviously, segregation was humiliating in so many ways, countless daily ways, but the buses in many ways were the worst, because it was like this traveling theater of human degradation. You'd be trapped on this bus for everybody to see, and the bus driver would take your money and then make you get out and walk around to the back. Sometimes he would drive off while you were walking around in the back. And of course, as we know, he'd make you give up your seat for a white passenger. Sometimes he'd make you just get off the bus if there wasn't. The buses were so humiliating that when the people decided that they were really going to stand up, they needed somebody to convince them that they could do this, that together it might make a difference. And they asked King, just because he was new in town, really, because he hadn't made too many enemies yet, and he had a reputation for being a pretty good speaker. And he gets up there that night, spontaneously. First, he has 20 minutes to prepare this speech, the biggest speech of his life, and he has a panic attack. He can't breathe. He can't think. Finally, Ralph Abernathy's outside honking the horn saying, "We got to go." And he hops in the car and gets there, and there's thousands of people. The church is overflowing, people filling the streets. They're setting up loudspeakers on the streets. And King gets up there and says God spoke for him. God spoke through him, is what he said. And he said, if we're wrong in demanding equal rights, then the Constitution is wrong. If we're wrong, the Supreme Court is wrong. If we are wrong, the Bible is wrong. God Almighty is wrong. And it just may be that we are right, and we are the people who are going to teach the world what justice looks like. That the people who've been treated the worst are the ones who are going to show the true power of democracy. And that's when he finds his message. And that's when he really can't even go back to just being a preacher anymore, because not just the people of Montgomery have discovered him, but the world discovers him, and that really in that moment, almost overnight.
Awesome. So we've talked about sort of how he's gotten to sort of that particular point of his life. Let's talk about the why, and let's talk about the how. So in my sort of reading the book, as I was thinking about sort of his role and his decision to start being a pacifist and start using sort of nonviolent tactics, I was reminded of actually research that I did during my master's program when I was focusing on the Fisk Jubilee singers of Fisk University, and those individuals finding ways to weaponize their voice. So these are individuals who are their parents, their grandparents were enslaved persons, and so these same spirituals that were being sung in the plantation are being passed down to these new individuals, and they're taking these spirituals and singing them all over the country and finding ways to weaponize their voice to bring attention to African Americans and so on and so forth. And so I thought about King using his faith or weaponizing his faith as a form of nonviolence, pacifism, and so on and so forth to really define what his movement was. Can you talk about sort of what that decision looked like for him to really lean more towards nonviolence and making sure that even after the bombing of his home, he was urging his followers to not pick up their arms, to really make sure that we were, again, sticking to that plan?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really important to remember that this is happening in real time to a guy who's 26 years old when the Montgomery bus boycott begins. And he, of course, believes in the teachings of Jesus. He's been to college, he's read some Thoreau, he's read some Gandhi, but it's like school stuff, right? He hasn't ever had to apply it to his life yet. He might apply it to some of his sermons, but now he's got to decide how much he wants to live it. And when the Montgomery bus boycott begins, a lot of people see this as a huge opportunity for the nation. A lot of these older activists see this young guy, this young movement coming together in a way that really nothing like it has ever been seen before. And they go down to Montgomery and they say, how committed are you really to this nonviolent thing? Because we've been talking about it for years. And King says, I'm interested in it, but he's still got a gun in the house. And it's Bayard Rustin who says, well, if we're going to talk about Gandhi, the first thing you got to do is get rid of the gun under your sofa cushion. So King says, okay, he gets rid of the gun, he calls off the armed guards that are out in front of his house. And when his home is bombed, as you mentioned, he comes back to the house. He was at Abernathy's church that night when the house was bombed and his Coretta and the baby were inside, and nobody was hurt, thank God. But there's an angry mob of black people in the streets ready to fight, ready to bust some heads, because they know who did this. They know it was the Klan. They know, and the white leaders of the community, the mayor and the police chief, are on the porch with King, hoping that King is going to diffuse the tension here. And that's the moment, really, when King speaks to the crowd and says, put down your guns, go home and put them away. We're not going to need them. We are going to show that we are the greater moral power here, that we're, and this is really the message of Gandhi and Howard Thurman and so many others that King had read and studied, and now he's beginning to apply it. He begins to realize that by choosing nonviolence, you have the potential to take away the power of people who are more powerful than you in terms of numbers, in terms of weapons. You can never fight and win if you're going to pick up arms against the Klan, against the government, against the police. You're outnumbered. But if you can show that you are the greater moral power, that you are willing to turn the other cheek, you weaken your opponent. And that's really what began to work. And that's when the northern media discovered the story of the Montgomery bus boycott, because it now becomes a classic story of David and Goliath. It's the little guy taking on the big guy, and at least the white northern media sees the black people of Montgomery as the heroes of this story. Mm-hmm. And that works pretty well until King begins talking about segregation and racism in the North.
So let's shift gears a little bit, because I recall from our conversation earlier that you actually, project has been going on for about 6 years, I think you were saying before, which means that you actually did some of your research during the pandemic as well. And so I recall from doing my master's program and actually writing my master's thesis during the pandemic that researching and being in conversation with individuals and getting to archives and all of that was a lot more challenging than it might have been in the past, especially because there was so much uncertainty around that time. Can you talk about, because you, even with your book, you use such a wealth of sources, of news sources and so on and so forth, so there's so much information to include. Can you talk about what your process was for being in conversation with these sources and interrogating them, especially and particularly during the pandemic as well?
Yeah, writing during the pandemic was no fun, especially with my kids and wife all working from our little apartment in Chicago, and my daughter, who at the time was 7, thought it was really funny to try to sneak up on me and shoot me with a water gun when I was writing, and I kept saying, I'm working. And she said, no, you're not, you're just sitting there. Mom's working because I can hear her on the phone. You don't work. You just sit there and think or something, right? But I was very lucky that I started doing my interviews before the pandemic. I was able to get to Harry Belafonte and John Lewis and Andrew Young and Jesse Jackson and all of the people who knew King, who you've never heard of probably, like his barber, Nelson Malden in Montgomery, and his good friend June Dobbs Butts in Atlanta, who grew up with him on Auburn Avenue. I was able to do a lot of those interviews in person. And then when the pandemic hit, I couldn't go to a lot of archives, which really was difficult, and I had to basically pay these archivists to digitize stuff for me. But the one fringe benefit was that those old folks who, it took really a long time to arrange interviews with folks like John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette and Reverend James Lawson, now they were stuck at home and I could call them every day. They were happy to have the phone ring. Reverend Lawson, who taught a class in LA on nonviolent protest, his class was suspended, and I said, can I take the class remotely? And I called him every Tuesday night, and we talked for an hour and a half, and he just gave me, he just lectured me. And June Dobbs Butts, his friend from Atlanta, she was in a nursing home and no family could visit her. I called her pretty much like 3 or 4 times a week for months. And these people became friends as well as great sources. And I recognized early on that this was, maybe the greatest privilege of my life, to get to know people who knew Dr. King. And to call a friend of Martin Luther King a friend of mine now, like, oh my God. I'm still, I get goosebumps just thinking about it.
And if I recall correctly, because I've been looking into some of your past interviews, this project started from when you were interviewing individuals for your book on Ali, is that correct?
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when I was working on my Ali book, I knew that Ali and King met twice. So I wanted to know how they got along, how they hit it off. If you get a chance when you go home tonight, watch the YouTube video. Just look up MLK and Ali, and there's this great video where King is in Louisville for a fair housing protest, And Ali shows up just to check it out, I think. Ali was not involved in protest. In fact, Ali was opposed to integration for the most part. He believed in separatism. But he shows up just because he's Ali, and he's a social person, and I think he wanted to meet King. And King's having a press conference, and Ali kind of like interrupts him and starts joking around with him. And he's the only Muhammad Ali could interrupt Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King was always very careful about public appearances. He had this image to present, and it was very important for him to show his dignity and not to like cut loose. He was a funny guy. He had kind of a little bit of a dirty sense of humor, but he would never show that in public. But Ali has him cracking up. King is just cracking up with everything Ali says. It's really wonderful to watch. But that process of asking people, who had met them both, really led me into this book, because I was interviewing folks like Belafonte and Andrew Young and Jesse Jackson for the Ali book, and just started tagging on some questions at the end. So tell me about Martin Luther King. What was he like? Because we treat him like he's ancient history, and the thing that just occurred to me was that he would only be 90. When I started this book, he would have been in his late 80s. Like he was, it was certainly possible that he could have been alive. His older sister just passed away in the last year. His older sister. So sometimes and I've been guilty of this too, we treat our history as if it's untouchable, as if it's remote, and it's not that long ago. And that's really what led me from Ali to King.
One of the things I really enjoy about this book, again, I love it, how brief it is. But no.
The last 100 pages are footnotes, so you don't have to read those.
But you should, because the information is just so amazing, and just being able to go through and learn more about King, and again see him in a new light, because you really strive to humanize him, and so that's sort of the goal that I've sort of had or sort of seen from reading it as well. But one of the things I've been impressed by is your style and your tone of writing as well, because again, as a public historian, part of my training is around how we can, as historians, so we're trained academically, so we're doing research, we're publishing, so on and so forth, but we're really trained on this idea of shared authority. How can we make sure that in writing and preparing my sources and conversing with the community and so on and so forth, we're always making sure that it's as accessible as possible. So not getting too stuck on the jargon, making sure that I'm in conversation with the community and they're involved in the story, so it doesn't feel as though I'm the sort of the lead voice in all of this. And so I love the way that you sort of laid out the tone and structure of the book, because again, it's a very accessible read. And so I wanted to know sort of what was your approach, because I believe you have some a background as a journalist as well. And so the writing style was just, again, it was very approachable for all different audiences and individuals of all knowledge levels. So I saw as I was reading it, and we're here today to sort of talk about how individuals and why individuals should be purchasing the book themselves as well. That is such an accessible book, and everyone can be able to come in and be in conversation with that story. So can you just talk a little bit about sort of the approach that you took towards writing it and deciding how you were going to structure it as well?
Well, thanks, Brandon. I appreciate that sales pitch, too. But it was, first of all, I am trained as a journalist. I'm not a historian, and I think sometimes that works to my advantage in that I know how to tell a story in an engaging way. When you write for a newspaper, they teach you that end of every paragraph is an opportunity for the reader to switch to a different story. So you have to create tension, you have to create drama, you have to create a sense that I've got to turn the next page. And King had been written about a lot, but almost entirely by heavy-duty historians and academics who were focused on, a lot of minutia. And there's some great books about King, like the Taylor Branch trilogy, which is like 3,000-something pages, and the David Garrow book, which is terrific but really dense. And I was very intentional about this. I wanted to write a book that people would read. My formula is to write the smartest possible book for the largest possible audience, because part of my mission here is to encourage people to re-engage with King. And that's a different mission than I would have if I were, a history professor and I was trying to explore some of the overlooked nuances of King's story. I'm really trying to get this book out there to as many people, and also it is such a compelling and emotional story, and I feel like it's the kind of story that if you read it and I've done my job, you'll cry at the end. Mm-hmm. And I'm really clear about my goals when I start writing this book. That's what I want to do. I want people to engage emotionally with King, because We've engaged with him intellectually. We've engaged with him sort of patriotically, but we haven't really walked alongside him in the way that I think we still need to, because his words still resonate. You know, he's speaking to us today, which is what another thing I loved about your museum. It's speaking to us today for where we are now, and history can do that if we are open to it, if we don't treat it as some dusty old relic.
Well, I will say, I won't say in front of the crowd whether or not I cried at the end. We'll talk offline about that particular detail.
Don't be shy, don't be shy.
But let's circle back to this idea of, again, embracing these conversations. Oftentimes, again, it's easier for individuals to romanticize this history, but it's also easy for individuals to completely shut it out, to say, well, this is something that's a little bit more challenging or something I would consider a difficult history or a difficult story, and I don't necessarily want to have that conversation. Because one thing your book does is it's, again, through the idea of authentic and empathetic storytelling, is very much is crucial and very intentional about these details. And so you'll see, as you're continuing to read the book, you'll see the interactions with the police, with individuals who are racist in this oppressive system, and so on and so forth. And to some individuals, this can be a difficult history or a difficult story to be involved with and be engaged with. So what advice would you have for a reader who might find this topic or topics of a similar vein difficult?
You can handle it. That's my advice. But, you know, we haven't talked about the most controversial part, the thing that I was most worried about, which is King's sex life. So let's just get into it, because I was genuinely concerned and thought a lot about how people were going to feel about reading about King having an affair, or, you know, one of the ironies of the FBI surveillance of King is that we now have transcripts of King on the phone with women, and we can hear him flirting, attempting to charm, and to me, it's humanizing, it's sad in many ways. He sounds lonely, he sounds depressed, he sounds a little lost. But it's important that we see him as human, that we understand that he was struggling, that he didn't live up to his own ideals sometimes. But what's most important about those FBI transcripts is that our government was using King's personal life to try to destroy him. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. They took these tapes, they sent a compilation of the tapes to Coretta. They attached a note to King saying, the only way out for you is suicide. The FBI, our government, our tax dollars did that. And why? Let's think about it for a second. Why was it a priority for our law enforcement officials and our president, because he knew what was going on, and our Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, who authorized the wiretaps? Why was it important for them to do this? At first, they thought King might be associating with communists. They quickly became convinced that that was not the case. And yet they reauthorized the surveillance, and they distributed it to members of the media. They tried to undermine King's work. I think the reason is pretty clear. I think it's because they recognized that he posed a threat to the establishment, to the status quo, and that he wanted fundamental change in American democracy, and that he, more than anyone else, had the power to make that happen. That if King was successful in uniting black and white Americans, that we might be forced to change, and that people who had been hoarding the power for a long time might have to give up some of it. Mm-hmm. That's why it's also important to include the stuff about his sex life, because it shows us his humanity, it shows us his flaws, but mostly it shows us our government's flaws.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we're drawing towards the end of our conversation before we open things up to the audience for some Q&A, but I have one final question, and you touched on it a little bit earlier as well. We're coming off of what some have called it, or begun to call it, a dual pandemic. Again, the pandemic itself, but also the Black Lives Matter movements that were happening as well, and sort of just the country paying more attention to social justice and this idea of more individuals being more involved in those conversations and so on and so forth. What are some of the takeaways that you would hope that readers of this book can sort of use as a lens, or perhaps as a way to strategize on how we should be moving forward as a community, or perhaps even take away from the life of Dr. King as well?
I think it's really important to go back and read King's words and not just the carefully selected ones that are comfortable for us. I think it's important to remember how radical he was. And some people say he got radical in the last years of his life when he began calling out Northern racism, when he began attacking the Vietnam War. He was radical all along. In the 50s, when he would go raise money in the North and he'd come to Chicago, he would say, by the way, I'm going to be back because your segregation is just as bad as ours. You're just disguising it better. He was there all along. And we have this tendency now to position him as the safe alternative to Malcolm X. I think he was in many ways more radical and more dangerous than Malcolm X because he was trying to work within the system to make changes that would have an immediate impact. And even this whole controversy with Malcolm X, where we tend to pit them as rivals, that was generated by the white media. I found the original transcript of Alex Haley's interview with Martin Luther King for Playboy magazine. The magazine published a quote from King saying that King believed that Malcolm X was a danger to society, that his violent, demagogic oratory was bringing nothing but pain to black Americans. King never said that. Alex Haley changed the quote. What King said was that he believed that he didn't have all the answers and that he saw some kinship with Malcolm, and they were growing closer together. So I think we benefit from engaging with the real King, the radical King, and that the most important thing that I think he can offer us now is the fact that this man who had his home bombed, who was stabbed in the chest, who had his own federal government turn against him and try to destroy him, this man never lost hope for America and never doubted that we could be a better, fairer, more just society together. And if he could go through that and maintain his sense of hope, then we certainly can too.
Thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, before we transition, we have a round of applause. Now, we are about to open it up for audience Q&A. A few rules before we do so. We have 2 mics. We will ask this for our guests to wait until you have the mic. That's the first rule. The second rule is to, once you have the mic, please stand up. And the third rule is, again, these are conversations, so we want your questions to end with a question mark. So we want to make sure that we're making things easy for Jonathan to sort of be in conversation with everyone. So we will go around the room and we will have some questions from the audience. I see we have one right here in the first row.
That was terrific. Thank you very much. So you talk about how Martin Luther King is such a hero for so many people, and that his heroes may have been his father and God or Jesus. But who might be 2 or 3 other heroes that were in his life that most people don't really know about from anything that was written before?
His college president, Benjamin Mays, thank you. A. Philip Randolph, head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union. I think he identified both of those as 2 of the men who he most admired. Certainly, Bayard Rustin became a great mentor. And Stanley Levison, a white Jewish former, probably ongoing communist, was a huge mentor to King. King trusted him to write the first drafts of several of his books. I think those were probably at the top of my list. And Coretta Scott King, who I didn't talk enough about. Martin Luther King fell in love with Coretta because she was more of an activist than he was, because she had more experience fighting for justice than he had at that point when they met. And though he neglected her as a potential leader and in a very patronizing way told her over and over again that she had to stay home with the kids, she was a huge intellectual force that guided him every step of the way, not just early when they met, but she was the one pushing him when they won the Nobel Prize. She's the one who says, we have a greater responsibility than ever now to speak out on issues beyond race. So I have to put Coretta very high on that list too.
Thank you very much for this book. I thought I knew something about Martin Luther King, and turned out I knew very little. You just sort of answered part of my question. That is, why did Coretta Scott King do what she did? Put up with his womanizing, put up with the bombs, the threats, all of that, and yet she stuck by him and pushed him and really was very, very much, in my mind, responsible for a lot of what he did.
I think the answer is that she believed. She believed in him, and she believed in the cause, and she believed that whatever she had to sacrifice, whatever she had to suffer was worth it. One of the discoveries I made in my research was a series of tapes that she made in 1968, just after the assassination. She began working on her memoir. And on this tape, which had never been published before, she talks about discovering him cheating on her when they were still engaged. And it's heartbreaking. And she says on this tape over and over again, and this too, I accepted. She sacrificed so much, but you can tell that she knew that she was essential, and that she was, just as King had to sacrifice,